Good evening, everyone, and welcome today to How We Got Here. Thank you to all the people who are with me today, and thank you for all the kind words I got over the past week. I really look forward to sharing some information about the Black Tudors. Just a couple of house rules that I'd like to set before we continue today. Please can you ensure that your microphone is muted and your video is off for the session. All questions, so what we've also decided to do, we've decided to condense the program to 6 sessions, and in the final session will be an opportunity for a direct Q&A between myself and yourselves, where you'd have the opportunity to ask me any question you like. However, please feel free to ask questions via the chat room, and I'll try my best to get through to them as soon as possible. Please also note that we're administrators on the call, and they'll remove any participants for using any foul or inappropriate language or comments. What else to say? Yeah, the resource on the website on Friday, and sign-ups are now closed. So unfortunately, you will no longer be able to sign up to the sessions. Please do not share the Zoom code. Okay, let's begin. So how we got here? Let's move on a little bit. So for those who weren't here last week, once again, my name is Josh Garry, and I'm the course facilitator for the next 6 weeks. You know, a little background to me, I'm a secondary school teacher, deputy head, but we don't really need to talk about that too much. I really want into the topic. At the moment, we've been looking at the presence of Africans and Asians in Britain history. We'll continue to do that. Over the coming weeks, we're going to start paying more attention to the contribution of Black people to Britain, the construction of race, and what the special relationship means between the US and UK. Now, for those of us who weren't here last week, we looked at the Black presence in the UK, and if there was anything that I wanted you to take away from the session, I wanted you to really take away that people of color have been in the UK from the very beginning. That was the main thing I wanted you to take. But also, I want you to know that the Black presence in Britain stretches right the way back to Roman Britain. And we went over some amazing individuals. You have Cheddar Man, the Ivory Bangle lady, you've got the Beachy Head lady, and these are just some of the fantastic and really inspirational figures that we came across. And I do hope that, you know, in this session, I can introduce you to some more inspirational figures. Now, the question for today's session: what can the evidence tell us about the Africans living in Tudor England? Keywords for today's session: Tudors. When we refer to the Tudors, we're talking about monarchs who ruled England. So kings and queens. Okay, sorry. We are talking about kings and queens who ruled England from 1485, that was the end of the War of the Roses, to 1603. And the key term for today's session is blackamoor. And blackamoor is a Tudor word which describes, you know, a Black person, usually from the North African region. Now, what do you think of when I mention the word Tudors to you? Like most of my kids, the first person who comes to their mind is the controversial figure of Henry VIII. And for those of us who have young children, you'll be very well accustomed with the horrible histories. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And quite often when we think about Tudor history, we often think about Henry VIII, we think about his 6th wife. However, when I think of Tudor England, I think of rebellions, I think of popular culture, I think of the start of exploration when people started to explore the world beyond their shores. I think about colonization, I think about control. I think of a world more connected than we ever imagined. And fortunately, I got these ideas from the wonderful Kerry Apps, who's a history teacher in Southeast London, and she's shared a lot of her wonderful knowledge with myself. So, who are the Africans living in Tudor England? Before we look at who the Africans were, let's talk about where you could have found some of them. There were Africans present at the royal courts of Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and James I. James I being the Stuart monarch of England and Scotland at that time. So when I use the word monarch, I mean king. Now, the unfortunate thing, when we think of Africans in Tudor England, we are often immediately drawn to the misconception that they must have been enslaved. And that comes from popular culture. That comes from media where we've seen films such as 12 Years a Slave, such as Roots, which places in our mind the impression that Africans who have been in this country were always enslaved. This couldn't be further from the truth. The Africans living in Tudor England were free. And I'm going to, share some stories with you which will illustrate this fact to you. Now, also, which is very important for us to know, not all slaves were African. The word slave itself comes from Slav, referring to Slavonic peoples of Eastern Europe, who were enslaved in great numbers by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Great and his successors. Now, when we refer to the Holy Roman Empire, we're referring to modern day Germany, Austria, and that region in Europe. Now, how and why did Africans come to Tudor England? Before we look at some of the really, really fascinating figures and exciting stories, we need to ask ourselves, how did these Africans arrive on English shores in the first place? The century, the 1400s and the 1500s were dominated by Spain and Portugal. At this time, England was a very insignificant small island. They were the tiny island. They were a pawn on the chess piece. They were not the great players that they later became to be. Following Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492, Spain and Portugal divided the world between them in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. So this treaty pretty much split the world between the two of them. And I guess it explains to some extent why in Brazil they speak Portuguese and why throughout the rest of South America they speak Spanish. The New World being the Americas, and that was divided between these two great superpowers at the time. Now, Spain claimed the New World and the Caribbean to themselves, whilst Portugal looked towards Africa and the East Indies, classed as India today. Now, the death of the Portuguese king, Don Sebastian, on African soil at the Battle of Alcazar in 1578 allowed Philip II to annex Portugal. Now, Philip II, he was the king of Spain at the time, and through the death of Don Sebastian, he was able to combine Portugal and Spain into one empire. And so the colonies that were once owned by once owned by Portugal, were now owned by Spain. As far as we know, the Portuguese had been the first Europeans to visit the West African coast. They brought the first enslaved Africans to Europe, and from this point, a substantial Black population developed across Southern Europe, and a smaller population grew in Northern Europe too. By 1502, the transatlantic slave trade had begun, and over 370,000 Africans were transported to the Spanish Americas. Now, Black Tudors could have arrived in England not only directly through Africa, as some of them did, but also from Europe, the Americas, and places in between. As I've said, it was a period of exploration and movement, globalization. The world started to, in some ways, become smaller and became far more connected with each other. Now, when the Black Tudors encountered Tudor Englishmen, they may have found some of them to be xenophobic on occasion, but they would have equally have been deeply curious about the world beyond the sea. Most Englishmen and women knew little or nothing of the world beyond their parish boundary. And it's very, very important to understand, especially in Tudor England, how central, how important the church was to these daily people's lives. The word holiday that we know comes from holy days, feast days. The church played a key part in educating people. It played a key part in healing the sick. And on a Sunday, that's where people would go to get their entertainment and hear fantastic stories in the Bible about somebody called Jesus and the message of hope. So do not underestimate how important the church was to people at that time and how little travel most people in England would have been able to do. So, as I said, there may have been occasions where people demonstrated xenophobic or racist attitudes. But They are far more concerned with what was going on. Your religion was a far greater badge of otherness or your social class. Race, in the way we know it today, may have not been as big an indicator of difference. The image we have on the left is a powerful painting of Africans in Europe, but these are not of the Black Tudors. However, I have used this image to give us, a bit of an understanding for what Black Tudors may have looked like. Now, the term stranger. A stranger was simply someone from outside the parish. Tudors were far more likely to judge a new acquaintance, so that's a person, by his religion, as I said, or social class. They weren't particularly focused or particularly concerned about the color of a person's skin. Although, at times, the color of somebody's skin, their religion, and where they came from might have come into play. But as I said during last session, it's very important for us not to take ideas that we have from today and place them in the past. In a similar way that the misconception that Africans were always slaves is a very, very new or relatively new conception born out of the transatlantic slave trade. It wasn't at that time a given fact, as we should say. Now, the English and the question of slavery. Now, in some textbooks, you'll find that the English started getting involved in the slave trade from the 1560s. This is true to a certain extent. You had Englishman and privateer John Hawkins, and he did mastermind the first English transatlantic slaving voyages in the 1560s. However, he was very much ahead of his time. After his return voyage arrived in disarray in 1569, the English did not take up the trade again until the 1640s. To the right of me, you have Sir John Hawkins' coat of arms. Now, a coat of arms is usually, a symbol or an emblem that reflects the family. And as we can see on Sir John Hawkins' coat of arms, you do have an enslaved African featured there. But as I said, John Hawkins was more the anomaly. He was more the outlier. He was more the exception. He was not the norm. And the English didn't get involved in the transatlantic slave trade until roughly about 100 years later. So you have John Hawkins as an exception, but the transatlantic slave trade wasn't a major feature in Tudor England. In fact, it was said that the air was too pure to have slaves in this country. Now, I hope to look at the lives of various individuals to draw more on the themes around the African Tudors. How are they treated? Did the English accept them? Why did they come here? What kind of jobs did they do? Where did they live? Hopefully, over the next few slides, we'll be able to see and find out a little bit more about them through these really, really fascinating stories. The first one, the visit of Al-Anuri, the legate to the King of Barbary in England from 1600 to 1601. Al-Anuri was a Morisco, a Spanish-born Muslim who had converted to Christianity. Much of the Moroccan elite fighting force was made up of soldiers with Morisco heritage, which made them as much anti-Spanish as anti-Ottoman. Now, this is very important because during the 1600s, there was a lot of instability in England at the time. There was a massive, massive fear of a potential Spanish invasion. Elizabeth had gone to war with the Spanish in 1588 during the Spanish Armada. And at this point, Elizabeth was successful. But as I must emphasize, England was a small fry. Spain were the superpower, the leading power of the day, somewhat like the United States today. And Elizabeth had to build alliances, build relationships with other people, other countries, other powerful people to ensure that England remains safe. And that is what I find very interesting about the visit of Al-Anuri to England. Elizabeth saw a potential ally against the Spanish. And this raises questions about, firstly, how Elizabeth viewed Africans, and also about the potential power that Africans might have had. Now, interesting question. Who might have worked at Hampton Court. Meet John Blank, actually pronounced Jean-Marc. Now, I find John Blank's story fascinating. John Blank was a royal trumpeter. He was a trumpet player for Henry VII and Henry VIII. Now, his story is really, really interesting. Beachy Head Lady is probably the first African who we can trace in this country. However, John Blank is the first African who we have a name for and also who we have a bit of a story about. And his story is really, really fascinating. And it really begins to challenge the ideas we have of Africans living in England at this time. Now, it's quite funny. In 1509, I don't know, maybe through conversation that John Blank was having with some of his other famous trumpeters, John Blank discovered that he was being paid half the wages of his other trumpet players. Clearly unhappy, John Blank asked Henry VIII for a pay rise. The king agreed to this pay rise. And later, when John Blank got married, Henry VIII gave him a purple gown and a hat. Now, I find this story about John Blank fascinating because it once again challenges our misconception of what it meant to be an African in Tudor England. Being a trumpeter was a job of very high prestige. Most people didn't have the opportunity to play the trumpet for royalty. Added to that, he was able to ask for a pay rise, which gives an indication about how the king viewed him, how the king viewed him. The king did not feel that his race meant that he deserved less pay. And what goes on more, we find out about gifts that Henry gave him when he asked for this pay rise and when he eventually got married. Now, unfortunately, once John Blank got married, his story disappears from the books of history. We don't hear much about him, but his story is very interesting because it lets us know a little bit about how Africans were treated. How do we know all of this? As I said, it's very, very important to test claims with evidence, and we need to start looking at the evidence that we have. We first have the Westminster Rolls in 1511, and we also have the written petition from John Blank. The Westminster Rolls of 1511 features John Blank not once, but twice. Now, the Westminster Rolls was a tournament, was made to show a tournament in celebration of Henry VIII's first son, Arthur. Now, unfortunately, Arthur died, but this roll is evidence, documented evidence of the presence of John Blank, and so too is his written petition. How did John Blank migrate to England? There are a number of questions, and we're not entirely sure, but we believe John Blank probably came to England with Catherine of Aragon's support, and so had been a musician at the English courts since around 1570. He may have come from Spain, Portugal, all of which had growing Black population. And as I said, because of the growth in power from the Iberian nations of Spain and Portugal and the transatlantic slave trade and the New World, you had an increase of Africans in Southern Europe, Northern Europe, and England. Now, one of my favorite parts. So what was happening in Africa at the time? The meanwhile elsewhere. During this period, in Africa, we had a number of great medieval kingdoms on the West Coast. You had kingdoms such as the Benin Kingdom, the Kingdom of Mali, Songhai, and this is just to name a few. The kingdom I'm going to focus on is the Kingdom of Benin. And right here, you have one of the bronzes that was made by the Kingdom of Benin. Now, this empire was famous for its skilled craftsmen and renowned bronzes using lost wax method, which was applied by earlier cultures. Now, these bronzes can be found at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but you also have these bronzes at the British Museum. And there's another question that would engage in there, but I'm really, really interested in this particular bronze. Now, in the same way to early modern or Tudor monarchs, these bronzes were like portraits, and these portraits conveyed certain messages about the royalty at the time. Now, in Benin, the king was known as the Oba. And in this source, you had the Oba throwing 2 leopards with 2 mudfish coming in. Now, this sends a very, very powerful story or a powerful message about who the Oba was and about his power. Now, the Obas of Benin claimed to descend from the gods. They claimed to be deities. And in that way, where they claimed to come from gods, their power couldn't be challenged. In Europe, we have a concept known as the divine right of kings. And that was a concept that the kings or queens were specially chosen by God. In a similar way, the Benin Oba said that he was a god. Now, Benin was situated in West Africa, in modern day Nigeria. And to unpack this bronze piece, it says some fascinating things about the Oba. You see the Oba destroying 2 leopards. This is the Oba saying that I am powerful, I am strong. And that comparison to a leopard is also interesting. Leopards aren't necessarily the biggest animals in the wild, but they are the smartest. They are the most cunning. And what the Oba is saying is he's saying, I am like a leopard. I'm not only powerful, I am cunning. I know how to outthink my foes. And below the Oba, you have something else very interesting. You have 2 mudfish. Now, the mudfish cannot actually be found in the region where the Benin Empire was situated. But the mudfish carries a very, very symbolic message. The mudfish can live on land, but it can also live in water. And in this, the Oba is saying, like the mudfish, I am both a god and I'm also a human. The kingdom of Benin was very, very advanced and very well civilized. You had a king, you had administrators, you had military, and you had all kinds of different ways of them recording their history. And this is something I've always been very much attached to. Maybe my Nigerian heritage makes me really, really proud of it, but that's a very, very powerful image, which hopefully we'll discuss a little bit more next week. During my meanwhile elsewhere, you also have the Mughals. Now, in 1525, Muslim warriors known as the Mughals invaded northern India. And over the next 2 centuries, the Mughals created a huge empire that covered most of India. Here we have the Taj Mahal, and I absolutely love the story around the Taj Mahal, which I'm going to get into. Now, the Mughals had a number of achievements at this time. They built mosques, they built madrasas, known as schools. They had markets, hospitals, huntages, forts, and palaces. I emphasize these stories by showing what was happening across the world and showing these civilizations to allow us to understand that, yes, England certainly was advanced at that time. But that doesn't mean regions around the world were any less advanced. And now you have this image of the Taj Mahal. Now, the Taj Mahal was built by the Mughal emperor, and it was made to recognize his favorite wife. His favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, had passed away, and he made this to honor her. And I think that's a fascinating story. That is a hell of a gift to show somebody your love. Now, I have another question. What can this ship tell us about the Black Tudors? This is the remains of the Mary Rose. When looking at the remains of the Mary Rose, meet Jack Francis. Now, Jack Francis was a salvage diver. He was an expert diver. And both of these skills were common to his native land, but were extremely rare in Tudor England. Okay, it was, in fact, it was said that swimming and immersing yourself in water wasn't good. Tudors didn't believe in doing that. It would unbalance the 4 humors. However, Jack Francis, being from West Africa, was very, very well skilled in this. Now, the Mary Rose ship was a ship made by Henry VIII, and it was made to fight in or battle against France. However, when the ship set sail from Portsmouth, it sank immediately. And whilst it was, as a result of it sinking, Henry VIII needed to call in a team to try and salvage some of the guns from the wreck. And that's how Jack Francis came to England. However, the significance of Jack Francis' story is far deeper than just being a deep sea diver. Now, Jack Francis' Venetian boss, Peter Paul or Corsi, was accused of theft by a courtesan in Southampton. Now, Jack Francis gave a testimony in court, and he's the first African known to ever give evidence in an English court. Now, you might say, what's the importance? Why is it important? Why are you bringing up the fact that Jack Francis gave testimony in court? A slave cannot give testimony in court because naturally, the information you give is compromised. You are not free. You have to serve a master. Only a free person can give testimony in court. And therein lies the significance of Jack Francis' story. The fact that Jack Francis' testimony was accepted in England is a key indicator of his status on English Isles, but also a key indicator of the status of Africans in English Isles. They were not slaves. They were free. Now, the Mary Rose can still be found at the Mary Rose Museum in Portsmouth. I'd highly encourage all of you to go there and have a look. It's fascinating, the story around that. Now, where did some of the Africans in Tudor England live? Now, we know that Miranda Kaufman came across over 200 Africans living at this time. However, Miranda's book only focuses on the story of about 9. Okay. Now, these 9 African Tudors were usually found towards the south and towards cities with ports, cities that have access to the river, because that was the main form of travel back then. Now we move on to one of my favorite characters. You have what we call the ornate Drake jewel, not Drake the singer, Drake the pirate. What can you see in this jewel? When I look at this jewel, I see a black man, and I also see a black man in front of a white woman. And the question is, why might this be of importance to us? That's the question we always need to ask ourselves when we look over these artifacts, these pieces of evidence from the past. The image of the black man, or the black African, united with his face of the white Englishwoman symbolizes the alliance between England and the Cimarrons. Who was Diego? And how does Diego link or relate to this story? And Diego has to be one of my favorite characters when reading Miranda Kaufman's book. Now, Diego was a bit of a wheeler dealer, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to read an extract from Black Tudors, which will give us a bit of information about Diego. Diego ran headlong through the gunfire towards the boat on the beach. "Are you Captain Drake?" he cried. He had to get on board. He had heard there were no slaves in England, and if he joined the English, they might take him there. He knew some of their countrymen trading in slaves, but he was willing to stake everything on this chance of freedom. Nothing could be worse than staying with this Spanish master. He could not join the runaway slaves in the mountains. He had betrayed them once too often. So Drake was his only hope. "I must join you," he shouted. "Let me aboard." A bullet whistled past his head in answer. "I have important information. You are in great danger." Again, they shot at him. "Listen, if you do not take me aboard, you will die." They fired once more. "There isn't much time left. Let me aboard." At last they relented, and as his feet hit the deck, he felt elated. A handful of English sailors pressed around him. They demanded to know what he had to say. "You must send your word to your captain," he said breathlessly. "You must retreat. If you do not depart before daybreak, you will face certain death." A few men were dispatched to warn Drake and his trading party. Diego sank to the deck in relief. And that's just an open extract from Miranda Kaufman's book. And let's find out a bit more about Diego. Now, Diego was an African who had fled Spanish enslavement to join the English when Drake and his company attacked the port of Nombre de Dios in Panama in 1572. Now, in Panama, you had a group known as the Cimarrones. These were slaves or Africans who were enslaved who successfully resisted, rebelled, and formed the community for themselves. However, Diego had betrayed them, so he could no longer go back to the Cimarrones. He tried to play the Cimarrones off the Spanish, and it all came crashing down. So Francis Drake was Diego's last chance. And Diego managed to form an alliance between himself and Francis Drake. He managed to forge an alliance between the English and the local Cimarrones. Africans who had run away and established their own settlements in, like I said, the Panama hinterlands. Now, this is very important. Remember what I said when I was mentioning the Spanish Armada. At this time, the Cimarrones and the English had a common enemy, the Spanish. Now, the Spanish were making an enormous amount of money through enslavement of Africans and the gold reserves in the New World. The English wanted in on this deal, and Queen Elizabeth granted permission to people such as Sir Francis Drake, such as John Hawkins, to pretty much steal and pirate from the Spanish ships. Diego was very, very important in this because he played a key role in not only Drake's success, but an enormous amount of wealth being brought to England at the time. So as I said, this resulted in a successful attack on the Spanish mule train carrying silver across a narrow strip of land with the sea on either side. Diego then returned to Plymouth with Francis Drake, where he lived for the next 4 years. The story of Diego is important to us in a number of ways. Firstly, I believe that the Ornate Jewel, the Drake Ornate Jewel, which we just saw, actually features Diego. And it's rather interesting how the English at that time viewed the Africans. They viewed the Africans at that time as allies, as people they could work with. Also of significance is Diego's insistence of returning or following Drake to England, where slavery was not legal. As he said, there were Englishmen such as John Hawkins, probably the outlier in the case, who was involved in slavery, but by and large, it didn't happen. Jack Francis shows that Africans in Tudor England were free. John Blank shows that Africans in Tudor England could work. And Diego shows a relationship that could exist between Africans and Tudor Englishmen at the time. Now, when we think about where Africans lived when they came to England, and as I said, you had over or approximately 200, most appear to have lived ordinary lives. They married, they raised families, they went to church, and they were baptized. The fact that they were allowed to be a part of the English church is a huge indicator of the extent to which they were accepted. Remember, the church was central to it at that time. And the idea of heaven and hell dominated everything they did. The idea of somebody's soul burning in eternal damnation is not what the Tudors wanted. And if an African man could be buried, could be baptized, could be married, that was a level of acceptance. Now, what have historians written about the African Tudors? For many years, there had been very little knowledge of the African Tudors. The knowledge, in fact, was limited. Little was known about how many lived here, how they came here, and most importantly, how they were treated. However, recent evidence from historians such as Dr. Onyeka Nubia, Dr. Miranda Kaufman, Marika Sherwood points to a rather different story about the Africans living in Tudor England at that time. Now, the final piece of evidence I'm going to take us to is one I find really, really interesting. I remember during my A-levels, when I was applying to university, I had originally wanted to study joint honours English and history. And at this time in English literature, we had studied a poem written by Elizabeth I to the Duke of Anjou, basically saying that she couldn't marry him. And I had to find a way of showing how English literature and history work together. Now, one of my teachers brought me to a proclamation issued by Elizabeth. And basically, this proclamation was made in the 1590s, and it was issued against Africans in Judaism. And it was a little something like this. In 1596, she wrote to the Lord Mayors and Mayor cities, noting that there were, of late, diverse blackamoors brought into this realm, of which kind of people there are already here too many. She ordered that those kind of people should be sent forth out of the land. And when I was an 18-year-old, this is all I saw. And this came to me, or at least my teacher said, it was an example of xenophobic attitudes that existed in England at the time. And, you know, later on, I'd had discussions with people, and some people argue, you know, this is, you know, an early indication of the hostile society or hostile state that resulted in the Windrush scandal. However, as I've said, it's very, very important not to take ideas and attitudes from today and place them in the past. And a closer look at this proclamation reveals something entirely different. Now, the letter does pose several interesting questions about Africans living in England during this time. Were the instructions carried out? Was xenophobia rife in England during this time? What ideas existed in Tudor England around race? Why were there Africans in Tudor England? How well integrated were the Africans in Tudor England? And what was England's position regarding slavery in the realm? This document causes us to ask all of these different questions. I think a number of these questions are valid. Now, before we go into the letter, it's very, very important for us to understand what was happening in society at the time and understand the social changes in this period. And this might provide a more insightful indication of some of the underlying issues that might have motivated Elizabeth to creating this proclamation. Now, during the 1540s, there had been a sharp rise in the population. There had been an increase from 2.7 million to 4.1 million people by 1601. As a result of this caused more demand for food, clothes, housing, jobs, and an upsurge resulting in price rises in rents. And our poverty became a major, major issue in England. Now, this situation was made even worse by the closure of monasteries. Now, monasteries were like little churches where monks tended to live, where people were taught, where they were able to go if they weren't feeling well. They provided shelter and food for the poor. The rich also contributed by providing a poor relief. At this time, they had a constant threat of a war with Spain, France, and Scotland, as well as poor harvests in the 1590s, causing farming methods to change. Therefore, many unemployed farmers drifted away from the countryside to search for work. This ultimately, as I said, led to an increase in poverty and a key word, vagrancy. Now, the ruling class feared disorder and social breakdown because they felt it would lead to revolt, it would lead to riots, and eventually it may lead to them losing the land. Amid all these ongoing social problems, it could be argued that Elizabeth I was attempting to find a scapegoat to these and try to play on differences to push the argument that Africans were not welcome. Now, as I said, in history you have interpretations, and this is one interpretation of the proclamation. However, it's not an interpretation that I entirely agree with. The proclamation was issued to somebody known as Caspar Senden. Caspar Senden was a merchant, and he was a merchant who hadn't done particularly well. It was an attempt to try and get some money and trade the Africans in England for the imprisoned English soldiers. But the proclamation didn't work. And my closing thoughts are this. It is difficult to reach definitive conclusions about these documents. And it's difficult to answer all the questions. But the documents instead throw up so many unanswered questions, which could be explored further. To what extent did racial intolerance cause a problem for Africans living in Tudor England? As I said, it may have been a problem for some, but religion, class would have probably been a great issue. Why did race come into such major play only a couple of centuries later? How far did Africans integrate into Tudor England? As I said, they were able to marry, they were able to be baptized, and they were buried, which are key parts. How did the life for Africans living in royal households differ to those living amongst ordinary people in Tudor England? For the main part, most people living in Tudor England were peasants, most of them were poor. And you can find examples of Africans who carried and did work just as everyone else. However, what is clear is that Elizabeth's letter is not simply an example of xenophobia and a policy of removal of blacks, as I once thought, or as I was once taught. Elizabeth did not expel Africans from England in 1596. Rather, her Privy Council issued a limited license to a merchant, Caspar van Senden, and it utterly failed. The reasons for it failing, I'm not entirely sure. However, what we cannot say is that this document in itself is an example of racist and xenophobic attitudes that have played and have been brought to the forefront in today's society. Now, I spoke to a number of teachers, and a number of teachers gave me some key feedback. And now, whilst I admit that this is very, very important for the community, I thought it might be apt to share what's going on or what's happening in some secondary schools. Here you have a picture of my friend Hannah Cusworth. Now, she is head of department at a school in Dulwich. And she has some of the most remarkable ideas, and I borrow from her all the time. And I'd encourage teachers to follow her Twitter and also watch her blog on Curriculum, where she actually explains some of her concepts, okay? But here you can see some of her ideas. Now, her curriculum is underpinned by 5 key philosophies. She believes in chronology, scholarship, second order concepts, assessments, and inquiry questions. And here are some of the examples she has. So one of her inquiry questions, 5 lessons, is what can we say about Cheddarmen? And that is an evidential thing. You also have how Roman were the Romans, which looks at similarity and difference. Look at how did civilization change from the time of the Cheddarmen to Ivy Bangle Lady. Now, I don't want to focus too much on how she has structured her curriculum, but what I want the wider community to understand is that a lot of groundwork is currently being done in schools to decolonize the school curriculum. And the word decolonize is a pretty loaded term, and it hasn't been fully explained. I believe at the heart of decolonization is teaching a truly representative and balanced picture of the past, which will allow us to make informed judgments. That means when you're teaching about the Tudors, you do not just teach about Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. You include stories that encompass members such as the Black Tudors. That allows people to have a more informed picture of the past. You also have issues around how empire is taught, whether empire was good, whether empire was bad. And I think when we try and approach the empire or the teaching of the empire from that approach, we're completely missing it. We're completely missing the terror and violence used to underpin the empire. And when you really understand that, you start to ask other more searching questions of the past. And you have some more of her inquiry ideas here. Now, finally for teachers, you have myself there with Miranda Kaufman, and this was a day that a number of teachers got together and planned lessons around Black Tudors. Now, there are over 200 teachers already signed up. We'll be sharing the hyperlink below. Literally, what you can do is you could go onto the site and you can just download resources ready to teach in your classroom. You've got some amazing teachers who were there at the time. You have Chris Lewis, who had amazing inquiry that focused on significance. You've got Jason Todd, you've got Kerry Apps here, and you've got Miss Thorne, you've got some, the key players in the history community who contributed to the teaching and will give you ideas for how you can teach the Black tutors. So, next week, we're going to look at how we went from this Jake jewel here, where you've got the English and the African standing side by side, to this piece made by Josiah Wedgwood, I, Not a Man and a Brother. We are going to look at the transatlantic slave trade. However, we're going to approach it from a rather unique angle. We're first going to focus on the African kingdoms that existed at the time. And I believe that it's crucial to look at the kingdoms of Africa before we dive into the slave trade. Reason being, African history is like this big. The slave trade is like this big. However, if you don't put the slave trade in the context of African history, you can't really fully grasp not only how civilized and how developed that region of the world was, but how underdeveloped it became because of the transatlantic slave trade. We'll then start to look at resistance, and you'll gain an understanding of how Africans from the very moment of the transatlantic slave trade fought and continually fought until they gained their freedom. And even when they gained their freedom, revolutions like the Haitian Revolution in the 1700s were key to Africans gaining their freedom. And the final section, which I'm rather interested in, looks at looks at the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, how the transatlantic slave trade contributed to Britain economically, how some of the buildings you see are direct or come directly from the transatlantic slave trade, how cities such as Liverpool, Glasgow, London, and Bristol grew directly from it. As I said, teachers to follow, please find these teachers. And I'd like to give a shout out to Janie, who messaged me last week and gave a great correction. So thank you very much for that correction. Please follow our social media handles at Josh Priya Garry and Twitter and at Reach Nkaya UK. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the remaining time to answer some questions. We have roughly about 10 minutes. So I'll use roughly the next 10 minutes to answer any questions that we might have on the African tutors. Oh, good. I like that question. So, how come the Africans you mentioned? So how come the Africans you mentioned earlier did not have African names? Easy, Jean Blanc, and the guy that could Jack Francis. Were their names changed when they converted to Christianity? That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure. But what I will say, the first thing I will say to that is, in Europe, religion was a major thing, and the ability to convert to Christianity showed acceptance. However, what I will also say, and the answer I will give you is this: back then, Africans didn't refer to themselves as Africans. The concept of an African is a 19th century concept. It was formulated by the British. So the way Africans saw themselves, very, very different to the way we see them now. If the Portuguese and Spanish taking of slaves kickstarted the movement of Black people throughout the world, how do we end up with free Black tutors? Good question. Well, simply because this Portuguese and Spanish were way ahead of their time, first and foremost. England wasn't the most powerful country. And there are a number of, Tudor England was a deeply superstitious country. And because it was a deeply superstitious country, the idea of the enslavement of Africans wasn't one that they were comfortable with at that time. So for example, some people at that time would have pointed to John Hawkins' final voyage, which ended in disaster. And not only did it end in disaster, he died not too long after it. And some people felt that this was an omen that slavery was bad. Okay, so I need to share my screen, sorry. Stop sharing my screen. Okay. All right, cool. So let me read some more questions. Okay. Troy. Oh, so hold on 1 second, please. I will try to, but what I'll do in terms of the Dulwich Schools scheme of work, what I'll do is I'll make sure that it's put onto the system. And also, if you simply follow Hannah Cusworth on Twitter, you can find it. Okay, Troy, message me and let's see if we could talk a bit later. I don't know if his lack of pay was caused. I don't know if John Blank's lack of pay was caused by the color of his skin, but I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. Well, you did have other religions at the time, and Islam at the time was a major religion, and if anything, it was something that the Englishmen would have feared. However, the English wouldn't have looked at other religions in a positive way. So some of these people may have come to other religions, but they wouldn't have looked at them in a positive way. And also, you did have Jews, but I believe the Jews were expelled in the 1200s by King Edward. Okay. Oh well, just wanted, yeah. Feel free. Would just wanted to share the issues around the Diego story and the relationship with Drake and Hawkins. That's fine. If you put your comments, I can read them out and I can say, these came from Troy Richards. Well, when we talk about slavery, you have the transatlantic slave trade, which involved chattel slavery, and you had slavery that pretty much existed throughout the dawn of time. Now, the transatlantic slave trade was rather unique to a number of the other forms of slavery. So, for example, in Africa, slavery was a punishment. It was a punishment for example, if two kingdoms went to war with each other, the opposition of the side that lost, you may enslave some of their people. However, with the transatlantic slave trade, it was based solely on the color of somebody's skin. And it involved money. It's where people actually bought and sold. And it's why the lesson next week is very important, because in the lesson next week, we're able to see where ideas around race were born, where racism as we know it today came from. So what was the role that language played? Like in West Africa today, Wolof, Mandinka, Jola, Fula are the major languages. Is there any info about that? Now, I don't know too much about what role the languages played, and it's something I could certainly share. But what I can say is that the makeup of Africa we have today in terms of countries didn't exist back then. So I think the best example I can give you is Nigeria, for example, where in that region you would have had several different kingdoms. And as a result of this, so you found, for example, you had Hausa land, you had Yoruba land, you had the Oyo kingdom, and these people spoke different languages at that time. And you had some African kings. So, for example, you had King Alfonso from the Kingdom of Congo, who communicated in European languages. However, you had other African kingdoms, such as the Yorubas in Benin, who refused to take on European language or European ideals because their power was very much linked to their culture. Okay, any more questions? reading. Was Shakespeare's Slave Othello an important point in race relations? It's Shakespeare's play Othello is really interesting, but I think it's also important to recognize that it was made to entertain. So Shakespeare does deal with a number of interesting themes in Othello. Thank you. But with that question, Shakespeare's play on Othello, I'll definitely do some research and ask them, try and come back with an answer for that. I think we'll raise hands. More questions? Okay, I think, well, thank you once again for joining, and I do hope to see you all next week, where we can, have further conversation and learn about the role of the transatlantic slave trade in the construction of race, but also in the way Britain was shaped today. Thank you very much.